Emanuel Lasker, José Raul Capablanca, the 8th of April 1921. Capablanca comments.
Pawn d2, d4. Pawn d7, d5. Pawn c2, c4. Pawn e7, e6. Knight b1, c3. Knight g8, f6. Bishop c1, g5. Bishop f8, e7. Pawn e2, e3. Castles kingside. Knight g1, f3. Knight b8, d7. Queen d1, c2. Pawn c7, c5. Rook a1, d1. Queen d8, a5. Bishop f1, d3. Pawn h7, h6. Bishop g5, h4. Pawn c5 takes pawn d4. Pawn e3 takes pawn d4. Pawn d5 takes pawn c4. Bishop d3 takes pawn c4. Knight d7, b6. Bishop c4, b3. Bishop c8, d7. Castles kingside.
Development completed. White has an isolated d-pawn, but, on the other hand, Black has somewhat difficulty maneuvering his pieces.
Rook a8, c8. Knight f3, e5. Bishop d7, b5.
With this move and subsequent ones, Black exchanges pieces, which gives them a freer game.
Rook f1, e1. Knight b6, d5. Bishop b3 takes knight d5. Knight f6 takes bishop d5. Bishop h4 takes bishop e7. Knight d5 takes bishop e7. Queen c2, b3. Bishop b5, c6.
If the following option:
Bishop b5, a6. Knight e5, d7. Knight e5 takes bishop c6. Pawn b7 takes knight c6. Rook e1, e5. Queen a5, b6. Queen b3, c2. Rook f8, d8. Knight c3, e2.
Probably White's first mistake. They wanted to take a good defensive position, but instead had to counterattack with na4 and rc5.
Rook d8, d5. Rook e5 takes rook d5. Pawn c6 takes rook d5.
Black now has an open line and a strong queenside, while White has a weak d-pawn. Apparently the weak black pawn is not really weak because White has no way of attacking it.
Queen c2, d2. Knight e7, f5. Pawn b2, b3.
To free the queen from protecting the b-pawn and also prevent rc4 at any stage.
Pawn h6, h5.
To prevent g4 at a later stage. And also to make a demonstration on the kingside, preparing for further operations on the other side.
Pawn h2, h3.
Weak, but White wants to be ready to play g4.
Pawn h5, h4.
To pin the queen to the kingside. Later it will be seen that White is forced to play g4 and thus weaken his game even more.
Queen d2, d3. Rook c8, c6. King g1, f1. Pawn g7, g6. Queen d3, b1. Queen b6, b4. King f1, g1.
This was a decisive move for White. This was not the best move, but it is doubtful that White has a good defense system.
Pawn a7, a5. Queen b1, b2. Pawn a5, a4.
Now Black exchanges the pawn and leaves White with a weak isolated pawn that will fall sooner or later.
Queen b2, d2. Queen b4 takes queen d2. Rook d1 takes queen d2. Pawn a4 takes pawn b3. Pawn a2 takes pawn b3. Rook c6, b6.
In order to force road 3 and thus prevent the white rook from supporting its b2 pawn later. This means practically tying the white rook to the defense of his two weak pawns.
Rook d2, d3. Rook b6, a6. Pawn g2, g4. Pawn h4 takes pawn g3. Pawn f2 takes pawn g3. Rook a6, a2. Knight e2, c3. Rook a2, c2. Knight c3, d1.
The alternative na4 was no better. White's game is doomed.
Knight f5, e7. Knight d1, c3. Rook c2, c1. King g1, f2. Knight e7, c6. Knight c3, d1. Rook c1, b1.
If the following option.
Knight c6, b4. Rook d3, d2. Rook c1, b1. Knight d1, b2. Rook b1 takes knight b2. Rook d2 takes rook b2. Knight b4, d3. King f2, e2. Knight d3 takes rook b2. King e2, d2.
And black not can win.
King f2, e2.
I was not mistaken, but I played deliberately. White had no way to defend his pawn.
Rook b1 takes pawn b3. King e2, e3. Rook b3, b4. Knight d1, c3. Knight c6, e7. Knight c3, e2. Knight e7, f5. King e3, f2. Pawn g6, g5. Pawn g3, g4. Knight f5, d6. Knight e2, g1. Knight d6, e4. King f2, f1. Rook b4, b1. King f1, g2. Rook b1, b2. King g2, f1. Rook b2, f2. King f1, e1. Rook f2, a2.
All these moves make sense. You should study them carefully.
King e1, f1. King g8, g7. Rook d3, e3. King g7, g6. Rook e3, d3. Pawn f7, f6. Rook d3, e3. King g6, f7. Rook e3, d3. King f7, e7. Rook d3, e3. King e7, d6. Rook e3, d3. Rook a2, f2. King f1, e1. Rook f2, g2. King e1, f1. Rook g2, a2. Rook d3, e3. Pawn e6, e5.
That was my decisive move and undoubtedly the only way to maintain the initiative.
Rook e3, d3.
If the following option:
Knight g1, e2. Knight e4, d2. King f1, f2. Pawn e5, e4. Rook e3, c3. Knight d2, f3. King f2, e3. Knight f3, e1. King e3, f2. Knight e1, g2.
And white is helpless. If the following option:
Knight g1, f3. Knight e4, d2.
exchange knights wins.
Pawn e5 takes pawn d4. Rook d3 takes pawn d4. King d6, c5. Rook d4, d1. Pawn d5, d4. Rook d1, c1. King c5, d5.
Nothing left. The black pawn will advance, and white will have to give up his knight for it. This is the best victory and probably took away Dr. Lasker's last hope of winning or drawing the match.